If you've ever taken an interest in, especially, theistic or Christian apologetics, or been introduced to classical or medieval philosophy, then you've probably heard some arguments for the existence of God.
They're all shit. Well, look at that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today we're going to be taking a look at a video from Brian Holdsworth, Catholic apologist and captain of his starts to think deep thoughts but then stops right when it gets him to what he wants to believe without fully thinking through these concepts. Team. Now, a lot of Brian's content is relegated to specific Catholic teaching and traditions and its difference from other Christian denominations. And of course, he's had plenty about Catholicism to focus on recently, what with the death of the previous pope and the anointing of the new one and everything. But every now and again, Brian shifts his focus to overall Christian apologetics and making an attempt to do that thing that his own holy book tells him to do. In Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And he tries to make an argument for the existence of God in these moments. In my experience of Brian, he tends to do that, like I said a minute ago, where he starts to think things through logically, and then as soon as those thoughts seem to point him to his preconceived conclusion of God existing, that's where his thinking grinds to a halt, as any further consideration might just lead him right off of the God platform that he's so comfortable on. And I have no doubt that that's what we're going to be seeing here today as Brian attempts to relate to us a new argument that he's heard for the existence of God. So let's get stuck in and hear what Brian has to say on the matter. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm. Challenging Christian claims and cosmic creation, countless courageous, clever consciences choose careful contemplation, causing concentration on concrete conclusions and celebrating a cosmos created by chance, not a celestial creator. May keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
If you've ever taken an interest in, especially, theistic or Christian apologetics, or been introduced to classical or medieval philosophy, then you've probably heard some arguments for the existence of God. And it's also true that some of those arguments will resonate with certain people more than others.
That's absolutely true. For me, the argument that resonated with me for 30 plus years of my life was, well, it wasn't so much an argument as it was a tactic.
Fill them pews, people. That's the key. Grab the little ones as well. Hook them while they're young.
Kind of like the tobacco industry.
Christ, if only we had their numbers.
I was indoctrinated into the Catholic religion from birth and taught to never question the existence of God, and specifically the exact conception of God that was being pushed on me from the pulpit, lest the wavering of my faith result in my fiery descent into hell upon my death. Now, once I got older and actually came around to the idea of thinking through my beliefs, I found that I had no good reason to believe in any God, let alone the Catholic conception of a God. And from there, when I came into contact with all of the various apologetic arguments for the existence of God, absolutely none of them resonated with me in any way. And this was during the point in my religious deconstruction when I was desperate to hold on to my faith, so I was primed and biased to believe in any even slightly decent reason to believe in God, just so that I could remain the good little believer that I always had been and really didn't want to deconvert away from being. The only provision I put on those arguments for God is that they actually had to hold water. And the more and more I looked into them, the more and more I found that they absolutely did not. Not one of them. Not even a little bit. So I didn't actually become an atheist until I had exhausted pretty much all of the most common and even uncommon arguments for the existence of God, and found that none of them resonated with me to even the slightest degree.
Personally, I've always found that the moral argument and then certain versions of the ontological argument are the most convincing for me.
So, just for clarity, The moral argument that Brian is talking about is the idea that there is an inherent, built into us, objective moral code sort of written into all of our hearts and minds, and that moral code must have been put there by someone, and therefore it must be an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent deity, the kind of which is fully explained and explored by the Christian and specifically Catholic faith. This argument never resonated with me due to the fact that there certainly isn't an objective moral code embedded in each and every one of us, nor any moral absolutes in this world. I understood this even back when I believed in God. I just believed that there was a God who himself subjectively interpreted right and wrong, and then handed that subjective morality down to humanity. But I've always understood that all value judgments of right and wrong were necessarily subjective, and thus the idea of objective morality, the entire foundation of the moral argument, was nonsensical, even if there were an all-powerful deity. This was further exemplified to me by the fact that there's never been a single moral precept or idea that has been universally accepted and adopted by every society, culture, subculture, and organized system of belief throughout all of human history, which one would absolutely expect to find if moral truth was absolute, unchanging, and inherent to our nature, as put into us by a God. Add to that the very clearly subjective morality of Brian's own holy book, which advocates and prescribes practices for biblical times that would be decried as horrifically immoral today, such as slavery, subjugation of women, the stoning to death of unruly children, human sacrifice, and literal genocide, just to name a few. These things made it clear to me, even back when I believed in a God, that the moral argument was garbage. Brian also mentions the ontological argument as one of his favorite and most convincing arguments for the existence of God. You remember the ontological argument, don't you? It's the one that goes like this. 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And 6. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Yes, the ontological argument really is that batshit insane. Frankly, the first time I ever heard it, I was flabbergasted that anyone could hear it and not immediately burst out laughing at its lunacy. Then, the fact that there were people who actually believed this tripe and required explaining exactly why it was tripe further blew my mind. But to shorthand it, the ontological argument is basically attempting to define God into existence by defining a maximally great being as necessarily existing, because existence is considered by the argument to be greater than non-existence or just being imaginary. Well, one can argue that, by definition and this line of thinking, God has to exist, never once contemplating that perhaps your definition is bullshit right from the start. But if you can attempt to define your God into existence through the ontological argument, the exact same tactic can be used to prove that your God doesn't exist, by way of something like Eric, the God-eating penguin. Since Eric is God-eating by definition, he has no choice but to eat gods. So, if your God exists, he automatically ceases to exist as a result of being eaten by Eric. But of course, the ontological apologist could just retort with, well, Eric, the magic God-eating penguin, doesn't exist in the first place. He's just a character that you made up. To which we can then reply, neither does your God, and for the exact same reason. So, if these were the two arguments that Brian found most resonating and most convincing for the existence of God, particularly the ontological one, he's already not off to a good start in convincing me that he's capable of rational thought on the matter. Frankly, I don't see how anyone could be convinced by either of these arguments unless they were starting with the notion of wanting to believe in God and for God to be real, and then just giving in to those lackluster arguments out of pure confirmation bias.
But I recently had what I might call like a breakthrough in my own appreciation for St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological arguments that might just now make them my new favorites. And the reason is because I was introduced to an analogy that helped me kind of close the gaps in my own understanding of how they work and what it is that makes them so convincing.
Why are you doing this to me?
And we further my lack of respect for what arguments resonate with you with the cosmological argument. I have an entire video about why the cosmological argument is my pick for the worst argument for the existence of God. Now, that video was focused on William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, but then I also have a different video that specifically addresses Aquinas' arguments too. Suffice it to say, no version of the cosmological argument should be convincing, as every version of it that I've ever been presented with boils down to a mere argument from incredulity, where the apologist concludes that because they can't or refuse to believe something, it must not be true, is improbable, or the argument must be flawed. This is a specific form of the argument from ignorance, which is heavily at play in most apologists. The cosmological argument's generally structured as, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, it must be because an all-powerful God wanted it that way. And any more mundane or naturalistic rationale must be flawed and untrue because I can't believe that it was anything other than a God. So the cosmological argument is certainly nothing new, but Brian, you say you've got a breakthrough with a new way of explaining it? Well, let's hear it. I'm all ears. Well, actually, I'm all pink fur and one giant eye, but you get where I'm going with this. Get to it.
So imagine you're in just a wide open space that stretches on seemingly to infinity in every direction. But like the environment that you experience here on Earth, everything that appears in this space is pulled downward by something like a gravitational force, even though there's no ground. I get that doesn't make sense, but just indulge me. It's hypothetical.
You get that it doesn't make sense, but just indulge you on this. You don't think that perhaps starting off your analogy with a fundamentally nonsensical setup might throw your entire analogy into upheaval? Or at least litter it with considerable logical problems as we move forward? But let's try to meet you where you're at. Okay, so we're in this seemingly infinite void where everything is being pulled in one direction, downward.
And for the sake of those drawn towards pedantic questions, those of us who are in this space were supported by a platform that prevents us from falling down. We are in a static position.
Okay, so there is some semblance of a ground underneath us. So then, why did you have to make this so unnecessarily complicated and put us in this big empty void? A void which you started off by saying that there was no ground. But now you realize that there has to be a ground, or a platform as you called it. Dude, why not just say we're in a wide open empty space with a concrete ground that seems to stretch infinitely in all directions? That would have been a simpler setup than trying to put us in a different dimension and attempt to break the laws of physics, only to then relent to the exact laws of physics that we have here and now. So anyway, okay, so we're in a vast emptiness with a ground beneath us. Go ahead.
And then we notice in this space that there is a chandelier hanging by a chain, and the chain just goes up way beyond our ability to see where it ends. So if we're inquisitive and rational, we would probably ask ourselves, why doesn't the chandelier fall? What's holding it up? And if you really wanted an explanation that accounted for the actual depths of that question, that got right to the heart of it, would you be satisfied if someone answered you by saying, well, it's attached to a chain link right above it. You can see it there. That's what's holding it up. I hope you would say no. I would certainly find that unsatisfying.
So let's get the obvious and most prominent flaw out of the way here. And it's one that I knew was going to be coming into play the minute Brian said he had an analogy to explain the cosmological argument. And that's the same problem with every attempt to prove God using an analogy. And that is this. Like all of them, it's a weak analogy fallacy. Look, analogies can be wonderful rhetorical tools. I use them frequently myself, but they only really work if the things that you're comparing are actually comparable. When the things that you're trying to compare through analogy are far too different for what is true for one to hold true for the other, then the analogy is worthless. This is why the watchmaker argument and every derivative of it fall apart so spectacularly. Trying to say that because a watch has to have a watchmaker means that a universe has to have a universe maker doesn't work, because a watch is necessarily a man-made object. But a universe could come around as a result of natural, unguided, unintentional processes, much like any of the vast array of natural formations that we see around us occur. If anything, a universe is more analogous to a planet than it is to a watch, and a planet forms through the natural, unguided processes of things like gravitational accumulation, or accretion as it's called, and a variety of other natural processes that result in the planet's specific development and features. Similarly, if you're trying to analogize the formation of the universe to a suspended chandelier, you're straight off engaging in a weak analogy fallacy. The universe is far too dissimilar to a chandelier for your argument to hold water. But, might as well hear you out, keep on going, finish your point.
Because based on appearance, the links in the chain go on for as far as we can see. But just because we can't physically see the end of the chain, that doesn't mean there is no end. That would be jumping to a conclusion that we don't really have the grounds to make. But even if the chain did go on indefinitely, it still wouldn't explain what's holding it all up.
Alright, so now it becomes apparent where exactly this argument's going. This is clearly aiming to be a derivative of the first cause argument. Everything has a cause, and those causes themselves have causes, and those causes have causes of their own, and so on and so on. And if you follow this trail of causality back, you have to eventually arrive at a first cause, and that first cause has to be an intelligent, willful, ethereal, magical, all-powerful being. Right, that's what this is, but there's already a critical flaw in your analogy, Brian, and it's one that you blew right by without even realizing it. Here's where you tripped up.
But just because we can't physically see the end of the chain, that doesn't mean there is no end. That would be jumping to a conclusion that we don't really have the grounds to make.
You're right, Brian. Concluding without evidence that the links in the chain go on and on forever would be leaping to a conclusion that we don't have the grounds to make. That is absolutely true. The most logical position is to say that we don't know what is holding the chandelier up, and that we need to do some investigation and gather some evidence in order to reach any sort of conclusion. But do you know what absolutely would not be warranted? It would be assuming that there's an invisible wizard who cast a magic spell on the chandelier to keep it suspended with the chain being unconnected to anything. But then, when we build a tower to go up higher and see what the chain might be connected to, and find that it is in fact attached to a lattice work of metal beams that run parallel to the ground and go off in several different directions, and then, as a result of that, you revise your claim and insist that the magic invisible wizard cast a spell that created those beams out of nothing, and that they're being held aloft by magic. But then, we follow the beams and we find that they're all attached to towers that jut up out of the ground, but we're just too far away for us to see at first. So then, you revise your claim to the magic invisible wizard casting spells to form those towers out of nothing. But upon examining the towers, we find evidence of their construction, with tool marks and rivets and nuts and bolts. So you revise your claim that the magical invisible wizard conjured magical workers who he tasked to build the towers for him. And every single time we disprove your claims of magic through investigation and experimentation, and showcase that the best idea is to withhold attaching oneself to an insistent claim until we have sufficient reason to do so, instead, you just revise your claim of magic so that it fits the evidence, rather than changing the claim itself. See, we atheists are the ones saying that we don't know what's holding the chain up. We are the ones saying that we don't know what caused the universe to be the way that it is. So let's keep exploring until we do. And let's not commit ourselves to an answer until we have good reason to do so. And you're the one insisting that you know what's holding the chain up. You're the one insisting to know what caused the universe, even though it's leaping to a conclusion that we don't have grounds to make. How did you miss that, Brian?
But if, as you follow the sequence of causes, you only find objects that also aren't able to suspend themselves in midair, then you haven't gotten to an explanation, because logically, you have to know that as long as things are doing something that they can't do on their own, there must be a cause in the sequence that can do that thing of its own nature.
And here we have another problem with your line of thinking. You say that if looking all the way up that chain and not finding anything that seems to be able to suspend itself in midair, then you haven't found the cause and you need to find something that caused the suspension of the chandelier as part of its own nature. But what you're really saying there is that you haven't found any cause that is satisfactory to you. Say, for instance, if I can further your chandelier analogy, that we continue up the chain and we find that about 50 feet up, the force that's pulling things downward reverses, and above that point, everything is being pulled up relative to us. Another 50 feet up the chain from that point, and there's another identical chandelier to the one we started with. Now, since they are the same weight, since they're identical, and there's the same length of chain between them and that line where the gravitational force flips, they are in perfect balance with each other, both holding the other aloft. Hey, I mean, we aren't on Earth, right? I mean, this is some kind of a cosmic void that we're playing around in for the course of this analogy, and so we can play around with the laws of physics too, can't we? So, it's not that either of the two chandeliers' nature is to be able to suspend the other in midair, but it's a result of that gravitational distortion that's flipping the downward force that's causing the suspension. And perhaps that gravitational distortion is an entirely natural phenomena that we simply don't understand at present. But it is entirely natural, unguided, unintentional, and a brute fact of how the natural physics of this void that we're inhabiting operate. And just because it doesn't make clear and logical sense to you in the here and now, and therefore you're unwilling to accept it unless you can impose your notion of the magical invisible wizard using his magic to make things happen, is further example of you just making an argument from incredulity.
The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you.
So let's bring this analogy into our own reality. So we observe that you and I and everything around us exist, right? That's pretty obvious. But if we want to understand how we exist, we might ask, well, what causes us to exist? Well, your environment or your access to food and nutrition, a solar system and a sun that keeps you warm, etc. Okay, so all of those things are things that you could point to that contribute to my existence and the other things that I observe. But do any of them exist on their own? Or are they also dependent on something else for their existence? Because if they are themselves contingent, then just like the links in that chain, we haven't arrived at an explanation.
Wait, what? No, bad argument, bad!
The contingency argument, which is just another way of saying the first cause argument that I called this out as earlier. So this is built on a number of flawed lines of thinking. For starters, it insists that an infinite regress of causation is impossible. But we don't know that to be the case, particularly when talking about things like the fundamental differences that could exist in physics before the Planck time and prior to the Big Bang, insofar as you can say prior to in regards to the Big Bang. Or other hypotheses like the multiverse or alternate dimensions, etc. We simply do not know enough about how things would work outside the confines of our own universe and prior to its formation to conclude that an infinite regress of causation is an impossibility. Secondly, it discounts the possibility of non-intentional first causality. that perhaps the first cause, if indeed there was one, could have been an entirely natural occurrence as a result of the hot, dense initial state of the universe being a fundamentally unstable one that was inexorably headed towards collapse into the universe that we have today. And then the silliest, if not stupidest thing about this entire argument is ultimately that it all seems to work quite a bit better as an argument for atheism. Because by the very analogy that you've expressed, Brian, the situation described seems to scream for an agnostic position of not assuming a cause that you have no reason to assume. You've said that we shouldn't jump to a conclusion that we have no reason to hold to, and yet your ultimate Catholic position is doing exactly that. We're out here saying we don't know what's holding the chandelier up, let's keep looking, and you're the one saying that you're sure that it's an invisible wizard holding it up with magic. Now, do you have any basis for that assertion?
Now, whenever an argument like the one I just made for God's existence is offered, it's always met with a couple objections that I want to address here and anticipate. The first is that this only proves that there is a necessary being.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't prove anything. I mean, arguments aren't proof, Brian. They're arguments. Arguments are explanations of why and how existing evidence leads to a certain specific conclusion. Arguments can be valid and still be wrong in its conclusion. And of course, arguments can be made that aren't even valid at all. So arguments aren't proof. They're interpretations of evidence that can be wildly wrong. And the contingency argument, first cause, cosmological argument, the hanging chandelier, however you want to phrase it, it doesn't even necessarily conclude with there being a first cause at all, as I've already gone over. But even if it did, it doesn't conclude with any presumed first cause being a being. If we're defining a being as an existing entity, as a first cause could just be a natural occurrence, such as the Big Bang, which wouldn't be considered a being in and of itself, just an occurrence or an event. So, yeah, you haven't proven anything, and you certainly haven't established the necessity of a first causal being.
But not that this being is personal in any way, which I agree with. So a further argument is needed to get to that conclusion. And it's actually quite similar. It depends on observing the fact that personal beings, like us, do exist. That is, organisms with intellect and will. So follow that same logic. What explains the existence of these traits, that is, intellect and will? Because the explanation can't be something impersonal. In the same way that if we ask what's holding the chandelier up, the cause can't be something that is falling. It has to be something that is suspended. Otherwise, we've hit a contradiction. A cause can't give what it doesn't have.
Are you fucking kidding me?
No. Tell me you're joking. Please. Am I getting punked right now? You are not seriously arguing that because we have intelligence and will, that therefore a greater being of intelligence and will must have created us?
This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
The idea that an intelligent and willful God must exist because humans are intelligent and willful, and a cause cannot create an effect that has capacities and features that the cause itself does not possess, can be dispelled with a simple question. Is your God made of matter? I mean, there isn't a Christian in the world who would say that he is, yet we humans are made of matter. And so, if one cannot give something to its creation that it does not itself possess, and more to your particular extrapolation, if we can conclude that God has intelligence and will because we have intelligence and will, then we can similarly conclude that because we are made of matter, then the God who created us must be made of matter too. Similar to us even, meaning that God must also be temporal, since we are temporal. That God must be mortal and must eventually die, since we are mortal and must eventually die. And that God must also be occasionally mean and hateful and greedy and conceited and spiteful and prejudiced and bigoted and ignorant and foolish and wrong about all sorts of things, because we are all of those things sometimes, and one obviously cannot give to its creation what it itself doesn't possess. Or maybe that entire line of thinking is bullshit right from the start. Now, as to what could more adequately explain how we have intelligence and will, that would be evolution and natural selection. General intelligence developed to enable animals to cope with novel or changing environments. A more intelligent animal can exhibit flexible behavior, innovative solutions to new problems, and adapt more readily to unpredictable situations, ultimately reducing its mortality. The need to find and process food efficiently can also drive intelligence. Complex foraging strategies like remembering food locations or using tools to extract food or coordinating hunts, well, these all require advanced cognitive abilities. And the evolution of intelligence wasn't just a single event, but it was a series of major structural changes in the nervous system. The first step was the evolution of a basic nervous system, allowing for simple coordination and sensation in early animals like jellyfish. The next leap was a centralized nervous system, or a simple brain, which allowed for the integration of multiple senses and a more coordinated body. We see this sort of thing in modern worms. The third transition was to more complex brains with a feedback loop, allowing for higher level functions like navigation and abstract concept recognition. This is seen in insects like bees, for example. The next stage involved brains with multiple recurrent systems working in parallel, enabling a massive increase in information processing. This is a characteristic of many vertebrates like birds, dogs, and reptiles. The final, most complex leap was the evolution of brains that can modify their own structure based on what's needed, a process similar to reflection in computer science. This is what allows for most advanced forms of intelligence, like those seen in humans and to some degree some porpoises and octopi. Now, I know, it's so much easier to just cling to the notion that, nuh-uh, magic man make him smart 'cause his magic powers. I mean, that's a lot easier than pondering over billions of years of evolutionary development that took place over many varied stages and in accordance with eons of selection pressures and gene mutations and the like. And it's tough for all of that to make sense to you. But again,
The universe is under no obligation to make sense to you.
the rest of Brian's video devolves into appealing to the Bible and revelations within it as reason to believe in the specific Christian God concept. And to that I always respond, so, in summation, what did we have from Brian here today? Well, he started off giving us a glimpse into his mind and the kinds of arguments for God that typically resonate with him. The moral argument and the ontological argument, two arguments for God that are both provably invalid in their conception, if not bug-nuttery insane to put stock in. Then he spun us an admittedly new analogy to attempt to argue for God. I had never heard of his chandelier analogy before, but it was so poorly constructed that it strains credulity to the point of breaking credulity over its knee like Bane did to Batman. We're hanging out in an infinite void with a chandelier above us and questioning what's holding it up. Well, it can't go on forever, therefore it must be an invisible wizard using magic. Now, that's just logic. He never even recognized that his entire line of thinking was an unintentional argument for agnosticism, as it led to the inescapable conclusion that one should not insist upon a presumed answer to what was holding up the chandelier without sufficient evidence for it. But then he blew right past that and insisted on a presumed answer for what was holding up the chandelier without sufficient evidence. But that's what I meant way back at the beginning when I characterized Brian as starting to think about things, but then hopping off that train of thought as soon as he can leap to his preconceived notion of, therefore God, even when a little bit more thinking will show just how flawed that conclusion is. Then he put a pretty little bow on this box of bullshittery by insisting that his presumed first cause, which he hasn't even established, even though he thinks he has has to be smart and has to have will because we are smart and we have will, and you can't give something that you yourself don't possess. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to think more about that, but first I have to go finish constructing my watch in order to keep accurate time, even though I don't have the ability to keep accurate time. Right after I finish tuning up my car that can go from 0 to 60 in 5.2, even though I can't go anywhere near that fast. And I'll be driving it while listening to my homemade radio, which can decode radio waves out of the air, even though I certainly can't decode radio waves. But, where was I? Oh yeah, Brian, you're dumb. That's dumb. Your arguments are bad and you should feel bad. But recognizing that would require thinking all the way through these concepts, rather than just thinking them halfway through or less, and then smacking headlong into God did it. So we can safely assume Brian won't be getting to that point anytime soon. And so, that's where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise. All that link below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Salvi Mike, Autumnal Fling, and Jesus Was a Liberal 70. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.